Okay, we're going to continue in our series on how to read the Bible. We're going to be talking about the last genre of literature within Scripture that for the series, and it's letters to the church. And so, once you get past the Gospels and Acts, you're going to find that the entire rest of the New Testament pretty much is a series of letters. And so they are letters filled with dense theological reasoning. They're filled with confusing words and strange cultural references. And each of these letters were written by various apostles to instruct particular churches or groups of people. And so once you learn how to read them, they can be some of the most practical parts of the Bible, and they actually can be really great to read. And so it's definitely worth learning how to read them because they are kind of the boots hit the ground. This is how you live the Christian life. This is what you should believe. This is what's right. This is what's wrong. Very practical, and in many ways, much more straightforward than other portions of the Bible. And so that's a really nice part about them. They paint that picture of what does the life of a Christian, what should it look like? How are you supposed to live as a Christian in a world that's hostile to your beliefs? And so there's several things that I want you to keep in mind when it comes to the New Testament letters. And the first thing is context. Each of these letters is targeting a very specific audience, and they're dealing with what was often a distinct cultural or historical challenge. And so for us to read them today, some of the challenges the early church faced, they can seem a little bit foreign to us. And so because of this, in order to fully understand Paul's letters, keeping the context of the letter in mind is vital to understanding what that letter is about. You have to keep the context in mind. So there's historical context of these letters. Is the entirety of all these letters were written between 40 and 95 AD, which means that the church was only between 10 and 70 years old, depending on the letter that you're reading. That's not very old. The New Testament was written in a very short period of time, comparatively to the Old Testament. And so, because of this, the church was very young. It was composed largely of new believers. There were a lot who were still trying to figure out things. It was growing very rapidly, so it was constantly new believers, new believers, new believers. And because it was so early, they're still trying to process through the teachings of Jesus, process what you should believe, how to interpret the Old Testament in light of Christ, etc., etc. And so many of them, the new believers, even converted from Judaism or even pagan beliefs, where they believed in a multiplicity of different gods. And so Christians were the minority religious group in the region at the time. And so for the Jewish converts, they're going to struggle with the concepts that Gentiles are now a part of the covenant and that they themselves were no longer under the law like they always were. And that suddenly that is a drastic shift for you. If you've always lived under a certain set of rules and suddenly they're gone, it's a little bit disorienting. And so for Gentile converts, they struggle with this transition from paganism to monotheism, that there aren't hundreds of different gods that I have to be worshiping and sacrificing to, and that are petty and have all these different craziness going on. Instead, there's one God. He's all powerful God, and so there's going to be this constant, like, it's going to be this paradigm shift for both groups. And so there's a lot of very strange and inaccurate beliefs and heresies that the apostles were combating with the development of the early church. And that's what is coming out in a lot of these letters, is that they are facing, like, there's these weird beliefs. Oftentimes what you'll find is when someone is a new believer, that's inexperienced in the Bible, they're going to come with their worldview that they currently live under and have some odd beliefs that, as you continue to read and study the Bible, those get filtered out. As they receive good teaching, that gets filtered out. Um, but in the beginning, especially, there are some hard, odd beliefs that take place. And so this is very much the case, except that the new believers almost outnumbered the older, more seasoned believers. And so a lot was happening at this time. So that's context number one. But secondly, the church was under a very significant persecution, not just from the Jews, but from the Romans as well. So we know that before his conversion, Paul was tasked by the Jewish religious leaders with hunting down Christians for imprisonment and even execution. We read this in Acts chapter 22, verses 19 to 20. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. So Paul himself was participated in that persecution. And so that you have the Jewish believers, the Orthodox Jews that are persecuting this Christian church, and then you have Roman persecution as well. That's not uncommon at all. During much of the time of these letters that was written, the Roman Empire had actually one of its most infamous rulers of all time, and that was the Emperor Nero. Nero was known, when you read history books about Rome and Nero was known for his cruelty, his insanity, his lack of morals. He was crazy. He was literally crazy. He killed his mother, his stepbrother, and his own wife, all so that he could marry another woman. He's perhaps most famous for burning his own city, Rome, down and then blaming it on the Christians. And in retaliation for the burning of the city of Rome, he would have Christians executed either by being fed to wild animals in the Colosseum, and that would be the entertainment that people would watch somebody go get devoured by a lion, and it would be these Christians. And sometimes they would even be burnt on crosses that were lining the streets of Rome as streetlights so that they would light the streets at night. And so the streets of Rome would be lit by burning Christians. So you have to understand the context with which these people are living their daily life. When you follow Jesus, when you believe in Jesus, these people truly believed in Jesus. This was not something that was just easy to do. It was not popular to do. We get lost in that in the Bible Belt here, where Chattanooga is the most churched city in the entire world. And so we get lost in that. And yet here we are reading these letters of these people who could literally lose their life, be beaten, be mistreated, be turned publicly ostracized, etc., just simply for believing in Jesus. And so this is important context when it comes to reading the New Testament letters, because this is the world that these people, these Christians, are living in. This is the world they're trying to learn how to navigate and live as Christ would live in this time. And so it's for this reason that we see suffering for your faith as a common theme and topic in the New Testament letters. It pops up everywhere talking about this concept. Hebrews chapter 10, verses 32 to 34. Remember those earlier days after you had received the light, when you endured in a great conflict full of suffering. Sometimes you were publicly exposed to insult and persecution. At other times, you stood side by side with those who were so treated. You suffered along with those in prison and joyfully accepted the confiscation of your property, because you knew that you yourselves had better and lasting possessions. So, this is a historical context. There's some cultural context as well. In a related sense, understanding that the specific cultural issues that are referenced in each of the letters, understanding those are going to help you understand the letters better, because you have the historical context, but a lot of those letters come out of these cultural or geographically significant events that are taking place that are leading the apostles to need to write a letter to the church in that area. So, for example, Philemon, it is rather confusing to modern readers. Philemon is a letter from Paul that is written to a Christian named Philemon, whose slave, Onesimus, had to run away. And Onesimus, uh, or he did not have to run away, he did run away. He ran away, and while on the run from his master, Onesimus runs into Paul, encounters Paul, and he becomes a Christian while fleeing from his master. And so Paul actually knew his master Philemon personally, and so he sent a letter on behalf of Onesimus, who Paul on behalf of Paul Onesimus, sending it back to his master. And so Paul was sending Onesimus back, and he writes this letter on behalf of Onesimus to Philemon, and he's basically he's defending Onesimus. He's mediating on behalf of Onesimus here. And so, in a culture where slavery is non-existent, this letter can feel kind of pointless. Why are we reading about slavery here when we don't live in a world where there's much slavery anymore? And instead, it is a deeply personal letter. And this letter, actually, when you look at it and you understand the context, this letter addresses the topic of forgiveness and the love of God that we should have and the value we should have for other people and other believers. Um, Another example would be 1 Corinthians 8, which deals with the question of if it is acceptable to eat food that was sacrificed to pagan idols. And so, as a result of living in a pagan culture, there are often these festivals that involve sacrifices to idols, and the food of which would then be feasted on by festival goers. While Christians were discouraged from actually attending these festivals, the leftover food would be sold in the markets. And in 1 Corinthians 8, Paul addresses this issue and he points out the idols have no real power and that there is only one true God. And so as a result, Paul says that believers don't need to worry about if the food was from idol worship when they purchased it from the market. So he warns of eating the same food around believers who are mistaken in believing that there's this evil spiritual significance tied to that food. So he does give that warning. And he says that some believers may feel convicted that they can't eat the food, and when they see someone else eat the food who isn't under those convictions, it may lead them to say, well, they're eating it, and so even though I feel convicted in this way, I'm going to eat it too, and that thus they violate their conscience and sin, because if you do think something is wrong and then do it anyway, that's a sin. And so this feels like a completely irrelevant chapter for us as modern believers, but it addresses this incredibly important topic, such as our freedom in Christ. Are we free in Christ? And also, it addresses the concern that we should have for other believers when it comes to our convictions may not be the same as other believers, and we need to be careful and conscious of that. So, we have the historical context. We've got the context that is going on locally and culturally speaking, and then there's also the biblical context. And so, as you read the New Testament letters, you'll find that there are a significant number of references to the Old Testament throughout them. And so, just as with everything else, it is so important for you to read the Old Testament to understand it. And it has become an increasingly popular view in a lot of teachers or tell you that you need to unhitch yourself from the Old Testament. And I'm going to tell you that that is not the case at all. You need to be very aware of the Old Testament. You need to study it. You need to be aware of what it says because everything else in Scripture is referencing the Old Testament. And so, for example, the first 16 verses of Galatians 3, which if you've been in Sunday school recently, you have heard, have 7 different direct quotes from various passages in the Old Testament. And each of those quotes is important, not just important, but crucial for understanding Paul's argument. Then 1 Peter 3:20 b through 21 says, when God's patience waited in the days of Noah while the ark was being prepared, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through water, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so even 1 Peter, he's referencing Old Testament stories here. And so I want you to take away this statement and listen to this very carefully because it's a very true statement regardless of which genre we're reading. The best commentary on the Bible is the Bible itself. In order to understand the New Testament, you have to be familiar with the Old Testament because the New Testament is going to talk about the Old Testament and reference it and explain it even at times. And so in order to understand the Old Testament, you have to understand how the story ends and know the New Testament. And so the Bible is constantly referencing and commenting on itself, as we have seen, talking about meditation literature and everything. Well, this is no different when it gets to these letters to the church. And so in order to figure out what's going on in the Old Testament, you have to be paying attention to what's said about it in the New Testament. And when you're reading and you find a reference to the Old Testament that you aren't familiar with or that you're just fuzzy on, follow that cross-reference and go read it. Go read that story, that quote, where go find it in the context that it is, because that's what the author is referencing. Next thing I want you to remember, so we've moved on past context, is that you are reading someone's mail. These are letters. Remember that they are letters. And that sounds like a very basic point. But would you read a letter that your grandma sent you by reading just a couple sentences a day? Or would you sit down and read the entire thing? And no, you would read the entire thing, because it causes the letter to be confusing and disjointed when you read it just a little portion at a time. And so, in the same way, verses and chapters can break up those thoughts that were intended to be read together. So, let me give you several tips to help with this. First, it helps to remove the headings, chapters, and verse numbers. Some Bible apps are going to allow you to do this, and most websites like Bible Gateway allow you to do this. And so this is a big thing that you can do. They also sell things called Reader's Bibles that have all of the references and books, chapters, and verse numbers and everything. They're all removed, and so Reader's Bibles read much more like a regular book or letter, and so that's another option for you if you want to read that way. But removing these items, it can help with the flow of the letter, and it can remove those visual breaks that can just really mess with your brain and get in the way. Secondly, it can help to start your study of that letter by reading it in its entirety first. The longest letters do take about an hour to read in a single setting. Letters like Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, they can take a while. Some of them do take as little as 2 minutes to read. So if you don't have the time to read it all at once, which is understandable if you're talking about one of these longer letters, read it in as big of chunks as you're able to. If you can, if you can't sit down to read the entire thing all at once, which I get, you should sit down and at least just read chunks of it at a time. And then you can go back and break it down. But starting this way, it's very helpful for hearing the flow of the argument. So when you're not just constantly stopping and starting and stopping and starting and overanalyzing, you just hear it in its entirety. Hear it as a large unit together, where you hear how all the arguments work together. Each of those New Testament letters, it's composed of these dense logical arguments which deal with theological and practical issues facing that particular church. And so the next thing I want you to pay attention to are the logical arguments. And this can actually be one of the hardest parts about these letters. People who haven't been trained in formal logic, the arguments can be really hard to follow. So what I'm going to do here for you is give you a crash course in how some basic logical arguments work. This is crash course. Try and make it as simple as possible here. But this can give you an idea of kind of what to look for, what kind of structures to look for, what words to look for as you read this. So a logical argument technically is called a syllogism. And so a syllogism is composed of various statements, which are called premises, that work together to form a conclusion. So the building blocks of a logical argument of a syllogism are two premises that build off of each other. And if these two things, then this thing. And so let me give you an example. As broken down as I can. If A equals B and B equals C, therefore A equals C, right? If these two are equal and those two are equal, then these two are equal, right? Okay. That is the most basic form of a logical argument as you can do. Now, essentially what logic does is it replaces those A, B, and C's with actual sentences or statements or arguments, and those are the premises, okay? So let me give you an example. If it rains today, I will wear my rain jacket. If I wear my rain jacket, I will keep dry. Therefore, if it rains today, I will keep dry. This is a very simple, if A equals B, if B equals C, then A equals C. And so these two, this is a breakdown. Make sense so far? Keep tracking. If not, pause and scroll back a little bit, rewatch just a little bit, just because it's the very basic form of an argument. Next, making it a little more complicated, but if A equals B and B does not equal C, then A does not equal C. Because A and B are the same, and B and C are not the same, then A and C are not the same. So, Let me give you an example of this in Galatians chapter 3, which again, if you were in Sunday school, you just read. What I'm going to do here is we're gonna break this down a little bit for you, because I want you to hear how this works. And so we're going to start just reading the passage, and then I'm going to break it down bit by bit and make it simpler and simpler until you can kind of see how this logic is working here. So, for all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. As it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous who live will live by faith. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says the person who does these things will live by them. For all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. As it is written, cursed is everyone who does not continue to do everything written in the book of the law. Clearly, no one who relies on the law is justified before God, because the righteous will live by faith. The law is not based on faith. On the contrary, it says the person who does these things will live by them. Okay, so that's a long chunk right there, right? Let's break it down into the essentially what it says. It says, all who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. No one who relies on the law is justified before God. The law is not based on faith. Okay, that's our basic thing. All who rely on the works of the law are under a curse. So all who rely on the law, cursed. No one who relies on the law is justified by God. And the law is not based on faith. Okay, so let me break this down. Let's show it to you as of letters. All who rely on the works of the law is premise 1. Are under a curse is premise B. No one who relies on the law, again that premise A, is justified before God, which is C. The law A is not based on faith. Let me make this a little clearer for you, because that may have confused you. All who rely on A are B. Okay? All who rely on the works of the law are under the curse. All who rely on A are B. Nobody who relies on A is C. No one who relies on the law is justified before God. Therefore, those who are B are not C. Those who are B are not C. This is making sense? Okay, let's do it even simpler. A equals B. A does not equal C. B does not equal C. Okay? So, this is the conclusion that we can receive here. So, Paul proceeds to use this conclusion as a premise in a later argument to reach a much bigger conclusion. Biblical authors, particularly Paul, often use very complicated syllogisms in their letters. And so because of this, there are some tricks that you can use to make reading the New Testament easier. And so understand that it is complicated. We looked at a simple example here. Start by reading the whole letter, or reading it in large chunks, like I said. Once you've done that, you're ready to dive in and break down the chapters. Read the chapter all the way through without stopping. Okay, now you've read the full chunk. Now when you actually start to really break it down, just, again, before you even break it down, read the whole chapter through. After you've done that, then move slowly through the chapter and follow the arguments that he's making. Track with him. See what he's arguing. See what he's saying. This sometimes requires you to read or glance at previous chapters to track with those arguments that they were making. So chapters sometimes break in the middle of an argument, and so the chapter numbers may not always be the perfect breaking point, so you may have to check back a chapter or two. So pay attention. Okay, so that's number 1. Start big, go slow through it, then read a little bit smaller of a chunk by the chapter, and then just break it down as you need to. Go slowly. It's okay to go slow. Next, pay attention to words like if, then, on the contrary, therefore, because, or so then. All of those words are markers for where premises and conclusions are being made. They're all the if words and therefores. Those are where you're seeing those arguments are being made. They're big markers for what you should be looking for. Okay? Once you've broken down and understood the arguments, reread the chapter again. And why I say this is because it can be really helpful to, once you understand it, once you've really read it, then to read it all in its context again. Suddenly you'll find that it makes so much more sense. And so it can even be helpful to summarize out loud or on a paper as you reread. Just be like, As you go through, just restate it in your own words, summarize it as you understand it. If you've been in Sunday school, you may have heard me do this sometimes. And it's okay for this whole process to take multiple days to do. Remember, reading the Bible is not a race, and comprehension of the Bible is so much more important than speed. It's important to understand what you're reading, so take your time, understand it, ask for help, Google it, research in concordances if you need to, ask me, ask Alan, reach out and find those answers. It's okay. Take your time, read the Bible, and don't feel like it's a race. So I know that these books can be really complicated sometimes, but when you take your time and you take them in chunks, read them together, and then break it down into bite-sized portions, what was intimidating can become much more understandable. So I leave you with that. As always, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me.